Assyrian warfare. Assyria began as a small trading community centered at the ancient city of Ashur and grew to become the greatest empire in the ancient world prior to the conquests of Alexander the Great and, after him, the Roman Empire. While the Assyrians' administrative skills were impressive, and they could be adept at diplomacy when necessary, these were not the means by which the empire grew to rule the ancient world from Egypt in the south, through the Levant and Mesopotamia, and over to Asia Minor. It was their skill in warfare. The Assyrian war machine was the most efficient military force in the ancient world up until the fall of the empire in 612 BCE. The secret to its success was a professionally trained standing army, iron weapons, advanced engineering skills, effective tactics, and, most importantly, a complete ruthlessness which came to characterize the Assyrians to their neighbors and subjects and still attaches itself to the reputation of Assyria in the modern day. A phrase oft repeated by Assyrian kings in their inscriptions regarding military conquests is, "I destroyed, devastated, and burned with fire those cities, towns, and regions which resisted Assyrian rule." The Assyrian kings were not to be trifled with, and their inscriptions vividly depict the fate which was certain for those who defied them. Since the subject states did try to break away from the empire whenever they felt they had a chance of success, a standing army was necessary to ensure the stability of the empire from enemies within and, as neighboring kingdoms like Urartu and Elam were often making incursions into Assyrian territory, a professional army was also required for national defense. These considerations, however, did not result in practical changes in the military until the rule of Tiglath-Pileser III, 745 to 727 BCE. The Assyrian army had been a formidable force long before Tiglath-Pileser III came to the throne. As far back as the reign of Shamashi-Adad, 1813 to 1791 BCE, the Assyrian military had shown itself an effective fighting force. In the period known as the Middle Empire, kings like Ashur I, 1353 to 1318 BCE, were employing the army with great efficacy in the conquest of the region of the Mitanni, and the king Adad-nirari I, 1307 to 1275 BCE, expanded the empire through military conquest and crushed internal rebellions swiftly. Adad-nirari I completely conquered the Mitanni and began what would become standard policy under the Assyrian Empire, the deportation of large segments of the population. With Mitanni under Assyrian control, Adad-nirari I decided the best way to prevent any future uprising was to remove the former occupants of the land and replace them with Assyrians. This should not be understood, however, as a cruel treatment of captives. Deportees were carefully chosen for their abilities and sent to regions which could make the most of their talents. Not everyone in the conquered populace was chosen for deportation, and families were never separated. Those segments of the population that had actively resisted the Assyrians were killed or sold into slavery, but the general populace became absorbed into the growing empire and they were thought of as Assyrians. This policy would be followed by the kings who succeeded Adad-nirari I until the collapse of the Assyrian Empire in 612 BCE. Tiglath-Pileser I, 1115 to 1076 BCE, revitalized the military and expanded the empire further. The military successes of these kings and those who followed them are all the more impressive when one recognizes that they had only a part-time army at their disposal. Armies in the ancient world were comprised of conscripts who were largely farmers. Therefore, military campaigns were conducted in the summer between the time of planting crops in the spring and their harvest in the fall. Wars were not fought in the winter months at all. This paradigm changed under Tiglath-Pileser III, who completely changed the course of how wars would be fought from then on. He created the world's first professional military. Tiglath-Pileser III decreed that now men would be hired and trained as professional soldiers and would serve in the military as a full-time job. He increased trade and the production of iron weapons and acquisition of horses, as well as the construction of war chariots and siege engines. Once he had his army functioning at peak efficiency, he put it to use. He marched north to defeat the kingdom of Urartu, which had long been a powerful enemy of the Assyrians, in 743 BCE. With Urartu under Assyrian control, he then marched west into Syria and punished the kingdom of Arpad, which had been Urartu's ally, in 741 BCE. He lay siege to the city for 3 years and, when it fell, he had it destroyed and the inhabitants slaughtered. Those who survived were deported to other regions. Campaigns such as the long siege of Arpad could only have been carried out by a professional army such as the one Tiglath-Pileser III had created and, as the historian Dubovsky notes, this expansion of the Assyrian Empire could not have taken place without the new organization of the army, improved logistics and weaponry and, in particular, the use of iron weapons instead of bronze. 153. Iron weapons could be mass-produced to equip a much larger fighting force than was previously able to be put into the field and, of course, were stronger than bronze weapons. Still, as Dubovsky explains, even though we can distinguish an improvement in Tiglath-Pileser III's weaponry, in particular in siege engines, the weapons alone are never able to win a war unless used in a carefully planned campaign. 153. Tiglath-Pileser III's brilliant successes in battle lay in his military strategies and his willingness to do whatever it required to succeed in his objectives. He also had at his disposal the largest, most well-trained, and best-equipped fighting force in the history of the world up to that time. In addition, there were archers and slingers, the archers equipped with the new composite bow which could fire long range over the advancing infantry, and, at the forefront, the siege engines of the shock troops. With this massive army, Tiglath-Pileser III firmly established the great expanse of the Assyrian Empire. By 736 BCE his empire encompassed the whole of Mesopotamia and the Levant, an area stretching from the Persian Gulf up to modern-day Iran, across to the Mediterranean Sea, and down through Israel. It was this empire and formidable army he would bequeath to his younger son Sargan II, 722 to 705 BCE, founder of the Sarganid dynasty, and the greatest king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Although the siege engine had been employed earlier in the empire, it was most effectively used during the period known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, 934 to 610 BCE or 912 to 612 BCE. Sargan II effectively used the siege engines on his campaigns and expanded the empire further than any king before him. His reign is considered the absolute peak of the Assyrian Empire, and his campaigns were models of efficiency, brilliant military tactics, courage, and ruthlessness. The best documented Assyrian siege, however, was that of the city of Lachish under Sargan II's son Sennacherib, 705 to 681 BCE. Sennacherib, like every other Assyrian king, was proud of his military conquests and had them depicted in detail in reliefs that lined the corridors of his palace at Nineveh. The siege of Lachish, 701 BCE, began, as such military contests often did, with Assyrian envoys riding up to the city walls to demand surrender. The people were told that, if they complied, they would be treated well while, if they resisted, they would suffer the common fate of all who had resisted before them. Even though it was well known that the Assyrians showed no mercy, the defenders of Lachish chose to take their chances and hold their city. The earthen ramp which Anglim mentions can still be seen at the present day at the site of Tel Lachish in Israel. Excavations have uncovered many ancient artifacts from the siege, including a vast number of arrowheads from both the Assyrians and the defenders, remnants of weaponry, and over 1,500 skulls. Lachish would serve as a reminder to other cities of the futility of resisting the Assyrian army. The fact that the siege ramp at Lachish is still in place over 2,000 years after it was built, while the city it helped conquer is long gone, is testimony to the skills of the Assyrian engineers who constructed it. Sennacherib's son and successor, Esarhaddon, 681 to 669 BCE, would employ the same tactics as his father, and so would his son, Ashurbanipal, 668 to 627 BCE, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire, who was so successful in battle that he laid waste to the entire country of Elam in 647 BCE. The historian Susan Wise Bauer writes, Elamite cities burned. The temples and palaces of Susa were robbed. For no better reason than vengeance, Ashurbanipal ordered the royal tombs opened and the bones of the kings bundled off into captivity, 414. Any Elamite who may have had even the slightest claim to the throne was brought back to Nineveh as a slave. In keeping with Assyrian policy, Ashurbanipal then relocated enormous numbers of the population throughout the region and left the cities empty and the fields barren. This would later prove to be a mistake, as the Persians slowly took over the territory which had once been Elam and proceeded to rebuild and fortify the cities. In time, they would help topple the Assyrian Empire. Ashurbanipal's sons, Ashur-etli-Ilani and Sin-sharishkan, did not inherit his military or political skills and, even before he died, were struggling with each other for control of the empire. After his death in 627 BCE, their civil war drained the resources of the empire and provided the regions under Assyrian control with the opportunity to break free. While the princes were struggling for control of the empire, that very empire was slipping away. The rule of the Assyrian Empire was seen as overly harsh by its subjects, in spite of whatever advancements and luxuries being an Assyrian citizen may have provided, and former vassal states rose in revolt. With no strong king on the throne, and the empire vastly overextended by this time, there was no way to prevent it from breaking apart. The entire region eventually rose in revolt and the great Assyrian cities such as Ashur, Kalhu, and Nineveh were sacked and burned by the Medes, Persians, Babylonians, and others. The Assyrians' historical records in Ashurbanipal's vast library of clay tablets which chronicled their advancements in medicine, literature, religion, and scientific and astronomical knowledge all lay buried beneath the ruined walls of their cities, but their military technology and tactics had been firmly impressed upon the civilizations and cultures they had once conquered. This technology and their military model is incorporated into the armies of those who succeeded them. Later Roman military might and tactics, including the siege engine and the wholesale slaughter of those who resisted Roman rule, were merely developing the model of warfare the Assyrians had created centuries before.